Good morning and welcome everyone to our Sunday meeting. Every week at 11 a.m. On Sundays, we meet to discuss a particular topic presented by a student of Theosophy, and that is followed by questions and answers. On the first and third Sundays of the month, we are studying the key to Theosophy as a round table written by H.P.B. On the 3rd of June, which is a Saturday, we will be in Philadelphia for the symposium presented there from 1 to 4 p.m. The teachers that come before us, the initiate kings, the wise ones, the heroes of all nations, present to us truths that many cannot perceive for themselves as yet. These truths presented to us in time is converted to dogmatic belief because humanity normally tries to follow the teachings through the person that brought it into the world. But the Theosophical student is invited to ask questions, to see what is presented, if it fits into their own heart as the truth. The declaration of the ULT states that the policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the Theosophical Movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. Today's reading comes from the Light on the Path. The voice of the Masters is always in the world, but only those hear it whose ears are no longer receptive of the sounds which affect the personal life. Laughter no longer lightens the heart. Anger may no longer enrage it. Tender words bring it no balm. For that within, to which the ears are as an outer gateway, is an unshaken place of peace in itself, which no person can disturb. As the eyes are the windows of the soul, so are the ears its gateways or doors. Through them comes knowledge of the confusion of the world. The great ones who have conquered life, who have become more than disciples, stand at peace and undisturbed amid the vibration and kaleidoscopic movement of humanity. They hold within themselves a certain knowledge as well as a perfect peace, and thus they are not roused or excited by the partial and erroneous fragments of information which are brought to their ears by the changing voices of those around them. When I speak of knowledge, I mean intuitive knowledge. This certain information can never be obtained by hard work or by experiment, for these methods are only applicable to matter, and matter is in itself a perfectly uncertain substance, continually affected by change. The most absolute and universal laws of natural and physical life, as understood by the scientists, will pass away when the life of this universe has passed away, and only its soul is left in the silence. What then will be the value of the knowledge of its laws acquired by industry and observation? I pray that no reader or critic will imagine that by what I have said I intend to depreciate or disparage acquired knowledge or the work of scientists. On the contrary, I hold that scientific men are the pioneers of modern thought. The day of literature and of art, when poets and sculptors saw the divine light and put it into their own great language, these days lie buried in the long past with the Antiphedian sculptors and the pre-Homeric poets. The mysteries no longer rule the world of thought and beauty. Human life is the growing power, not that which lies beyond it. But the scientific workers are progressing not so much by their own will as by sheer force of circumstances towards the far line which divides things interpretable from things uninterpretable. Every fresh discovery drives them a step onward. Therefore do I very highly esteem the knowledge obtained by work and experiment. But intuitive knowledge is an entirely different thing. It is not acquired in any way, but is, so to speak, a faculty of the soul, not the animal soul, that which becomes a ghost after death when lust or liking or the memory of ill deeds hauls it to the neighborhood of human beings, but the divine soul, which animates all external forms of the individualized being. And now today's talk, who are the great teachers?
Friends, good morning. Thank you very much for being here. Who are the great teachers is the question that we're presented with this morning. And this is a question that can be interpreted in several different ways. We'll concentrate mostly on one interpretation of that question, but we'll also consider some other aspects of it. When we think of teachers in the theosophical context, we're largely talking about the Mahatmas. And we'll read some quotes that help to explain this idea, what Mahatmas are, their relationship to Theosophy, to the world at large, and to us as individuals. Another interpretation of this question could be, who are the great teachers of the Theosophical Movement? This would primarily refer to H.P. Blavatsky and William Q. Judge, in particular the teachers that the platform of the ULT, the United Lodge of Theosophists, is most concerned with. Another way that this can be considered is there are a series of luminary personages throughout history that have been teachers. They never necessarily went by the word Theosophy or called themselves Theosophists, although we would call them that by the definition as outlined in the declaration that was just read, all those who are in service to others. And by that definition, who are the great teachers would really encompass dozens, scores, hundreds, and over the course of ages, really thousands of people. So we won't go into that level of detail on individual personalities, so much as we'll concentrate mostly on the Mahatmas. So first, though, let's look at this relationship between teachers and theosophy. In the Key to Theosophy, H.P. Blavatsky says that the Theosophical Society, we can probably say the Theosophical Movement, is simply the storehouse of all truths uttered by the great seers, initiates, and prophets of historic and even prehistoric ages, at least as many as it can get. Therefore, it is merely the channel through which more or less of truth found in the accumulated utterances of humanity's great teachers is poured out into the world. So this is how we can regard Theosophy as a movement, and how essential is that the reliance of that movement on the teachings that have been passed down throughout the ages. In Mahatmas as Ideals and Facts, an article published in 1893 by William Q. Judge in The Path, he says, "The whole sweep, meaning, and possibility of evolution are contained in the word Mahatma. Maha is great, Atma is soul. And both compounded into one mean those great souls who have triumphed before us, not because they are made of different stuff and are of some strange family, but just because they are of the human race. Reincarnation, karma, the sevenfold division, retribution, reward, struggle, failure, success, illumination, power, and a vast embracing love for humanity. All these lie in that single word. The soul emerges from the unknown, begins to work in and with matter, is reborn again and again, makes karma, develops the 6 vehicles for itself, meets retribution for sin and punishment for mistake, grows strong by suffering, succeeds in bursting through the gloom, is enlightened by the true illumination, grasps power, retains charity, expands with love for orphaned humanity, and thenceforth helps all others who remain in darkness until all may be raised up to the place with the Father in heaven, who is the higher self." This would describe a great ideal for all members of a society such as ours, which had its first impulse from some of these very Mahatmas. So what's being said here is that the Mahatmas themselves are not some special non-human kind of being. They have gone through the same struggles and difficulties that we have, and have achieved a level of illumination, a level of enlightenment, coupled with compassion and dedication to the well-being of humanity, that allows them to fulfill this role of great soul, to be able to give back to humanity from their own nature, that is a radiant, that is the radiance of the higher self that we all share. He goes on to say, we should declare our belief in the adepts, adepts being synonymous, at least in the context of this article, with Mahatma, while at the same time we demand no one's adherence. It is not necessary to give the names of any of the adepts, for a name is an invention of a family, and but few persons ever think of themselves by name, but by the phrase, I am myself. To name these beings, then, is no proof, and to seek for mystery names is to invite condemnation and profanation. The ideal, without the name, is large and grand enough for all purposes. Some years ago, the adepts wrote and said to HPB and to several persons that more help could be given to the movement in America because the fact of their existence was not concealed from motives of either fear or doubt. This statement, of course, carries with it, by contradistinction, the conclusion that where from fear of schools of science or of religion, members had not referred much to the belief in Mahatmas, and the power to help was for some reason inhibited. So this recalls a talk recently called Never Need to Worry, right? It's this anxiety, this fear of judgment from others in the mundane world that we set up occult obstacles for ourselves, as was noted in that talk. The text goes on to say, occult help from masters requires a channel just as much as any other help does, and the fact that the currents to be used are occult makes the need for a channel greater. The persons to be acted on must take part in making the channel or line for the force to act, for if we will not have it, they cannot give it. Now, as we are dealing with the mind and nature of man, we have to throw out the words which will arouse the ideas connected with the forces we desire to have employed. I had to read this several times to get this. The use of the words throw out doesn't mean like dispose of, as we use it in modern parlance, right? It means we need to put the words out there. I mean, we need to use the words which will arouse the ideas connected with the forces of we desire to have employed. In this case, the words are those which bring up the doctrine of the existence of adepts, Mahatmas, masters of wisdom. Hence the value of the declaration of our belief. It arouses dormant ideas in others. It opens up a channel in the mind. It serves to make the conducting lines for the forces to use which the Mahatmas wish to give out. Many a young man who could never hope to see great modern professors of science has been impelled to seek for knowledge by having heard that such men actually exist and are human beings. Shall we not take advantage of the same law of the human mind and let the vast power of the Lodge work with our assistance and not against our opposition or doubt or fear? So the point that Mr. Judge is trying to make here is twofold. One, that where the idea of the Mahatmas has been set aside or minimized, assistance from the Mahatmas is also minimized. And where the idea of the Mahatmas and the masters is emphasized, where it's in common consideration within a group of students, then their assistance is therefore maximized. And that is because by using these words, by putting these ideas out there, we open up these channels, we create these lines of influence directly to the Lodge of Mahatmas. And the example that he gives there is, it's sort of obvious, but it's a helpful example because it's so, so common that we do this by putting out the idea of, she gives some examples, but you could say, Einstein or whomever, by great scientists, we see no problem with that idea being out there influencing young people to aspire to that type of life. And the same can be said of the Mahatmas. By putting out the existence of the Mahatmas as a fact in nature, we allow others to emulate that example and to aspire to be like them, which is what we should all do as student seekers. Those who are devoted know how they have had unseen help, which showed itself in results. Those who fear may take courage, for they will find that not all their fellow beings are devoid of an underlying belief in the possibilities outlined by the doctrine of the existence of the adepts. And if we look over the work of the society, we find wherever the members boldly avow their belief and are not afraid to speak of this high ideal, the interest in Theosophy is awake. The work goes on, the people are benefited. So this has a very real practical application for us to acknowledge who the great teachers are. By saying that it is the Mahatmas, we actually encourage the energy that we put into this lodge as students to be spread more broadcast and to be a brighter light, to be more attractive to the interested souls in our community. The reason that we're all here is we were attracted for some reason, to something about the philosophy that resonated with us because it was being discussed here, because it was part of what we do. And it is therefore beneficial to consider questions like this and to answer them fearlessly so that we can continue to be useful and impactful in our community. H.P. Blavatsky wrote an article, Can the Mahatmas Be Selfish? It's a provocative title, and it was very much in response to a line of thinking at the time that if the Mahatmas were not putting out all that they knew for everyone, unrestricted, that they were in some way being selfish. And so she wrote this article as a rebuttal of that idea. I mean, the short answer, of course, is no, right? But in the way she explains it, it's a little clearer. She says, as we are in this world of phenomena, we cannot be entirely rid of a sense of personality. However exalted that feeling may be, in the sense that no feeling of personal aggrandizement or ambition remains, we are, by our constitution and state of evolution, placed in the world of relativity. But as we find that impersonality and non-duality is the ultimate end of cosmic evolution, we have to endeavor to work along with nature and not place ourselves in opposition to its inherent impulse, which must ultimately assert itself. To oppose it must necessitate suffering, since a weaker force in its egotism tries to array itself against the universal law. All that the occultist does is to hasten this process by allowing his will to act in unison with the cosmic will, or the demiurgic mind, which can be done by successfully checking the vain attempt of personality to assert itself in opposition to the former. And since the Mahatma is but an advanced occultist who has so far controlled his lower self as to hold it more or less in complete subjection to the cosmic impulse, it is in the nature of things impossible for him to act in any other but an unselfish manner. No sooner does he allow the personal self to assert itself than he ceases to be a Mahatma. The law of cosmic evolution is ever operating to achieve its purpose of ultimate unity and to carry the phenomenal into the noumenal plane, and the Mahatmas, being en rapport with it, are assisting that purpose. They therefore know best what knowledge is best for mankind at a particular stage of its evolution, and none else is competent to judge of that matter, since they alone have got the basic knowledge which can determine the right course and exercise proper discrimination. So this is her explanation of the of how it could be perceived that the Mahatmas might be selfish by withholding knowledge. But she clarifies that it is only through their selflessness, through their complete mastery of the lower nature and union with the higher nature, that they can see what is best for the global community, in terms of what knowledge is put out there. Another definition from H.P. Blavatsky is from an article published in 1884 in the Theosophist called Mahatmas and Chelas. She says, a Mahatma is a personage who, by special training and education, has evolved those higher faculties and has attained that spiritual knowledge which ordinary humanity will acquire after passing through numberless series of reincarnations during the process of cosmic evolution. This process of the self-evolution of the Mahatma extends over a number of incarnations, although comparatively speaking, they are very few. An entity that is passing through the occult training in its successive births gradually has less and less in each incarnation of the lower manas, until there arrives, lower manas being lower mind, until there arrives a time when its whole manas, higher and lower mind, being of an entirely elevated character, is centered in the higher individuality. So lower manas is essentially dormant or non-existent, and the entire monastic principle is centered on the higher individuality. When such a person may be said to have become a Mahatma. At the time of his physical death, all the lower four principles will perish without any suffering. That's in contrast to the way it is for someone who hasn't perfected that connection to the higher nature. For these are, in fact, to him, like a piece of wearing apparel, which he puts on and off at will. The real Mahatma is then not his physical body, but that higher manas, which is inseparably linked to the Atma and its vehicle, the sixth principle, buddhi. A union effected by him in a comparatively short period by passing through the process of self-evolution laid down by the occult philosophy. A couple of interesting points here. One, that while the Mahatma is not some specialized type of being, in the sense that the Mahatma is human, or at least was, and thereby lays out the path for us to follow, us as humans. But they do have an accelerated path, right? So she's saying that there is a long series of incarnations, she says numberless series of reincarnations for us, but for them, they're relatively few. This must have something to do with their selflessness, their devotion, their dedication, their one-pointed concentration on the betterment of their nature for the sake of all humanity. She goes on to say, whoever therefore wants to see the real Mahatma must use his intellectual sight. He must so elevate his manas that its perception will be clear, and all mists created by maya, or illusion, must be dispelled. His vision will then be bright, and he will see the Mahatmas wherever he may be, for being merged into the sixth and seventh principles, which are ubiquitous and omnipresent, the Mahatmas may be said to be everywhere. So we should note that it's not seeing the Mahatmas wherever they may be, it's seeing the Mahatmas wherever we may be, right? Because they're everywhere. They are part of the sixth and seventh omnipresent principles. But at the same time, just as we may be standing on a mountaintop and have within our sight the whole plain, yet not being cognizant of any particular tree or spot, because from that elevated position all below is nearly identical, and as our attention may be drawn to something which may be dissimilar to its surroundings, so in the same manner, although the whole of humanity is within the mental vision of the Mahatmas, they cannot be expected to take special note of every human being, unless that being, by his special acts, draws their particular attention to himself. The highest interest of humanity as a whole is their special concern, for they have identified themselves with that universal soul which runs through humanity, and he who would draw their attention must do so through that soul which pervades everywhere. A few more quotes. This time from The Ocean of Theosophy, William Q. Judge, 1893. It is under cyclic law, during a dark period in the history of mind, that the true philosophy disappears for a time. But the same law causes it to reappear as surely as the sun rises, and the human mind is present to see it. But some works can only be performed by the master, while others require the assistance of the companions. It is the master's work to preserve the true philosophy, but the help of the companions is needed to rediscover and promulgate it. So here he's illustrating the distinction between the Mahatmas themselves and the workers in the world who promote and promulgate the Mahatma's message. So we might say the Theosophical Mahatmas that stood behind H.P. Blavatsky and William Q. Judge, they being the mouthpiece, they being the companions that were needed to rediscover and promulgate it. Once more, the elder brothers have indicated where the truth, Theosophy, could be found, and the companions all over the world are engaged in bringing it forth for wider currency and propagation. The elder brothers of humanity are men who were perfected in former periods of evolution. These periods of manifestation are known to modern evolutionists so far as their number are concerned, though long ago understood by not only the older Hindus, but also by those great minds and men who instituted and carried on the first pure and undefaced form of the mysteries of Greece. The periods, when out of the great unknown there come forth the visible universes, are eternal in their coming and going, alternating with equal periods of silence and rest again in the unknown. The object of these mighty waves is the production of perfect man, the evolution of soul, and they always witness the increase of the number of elder brothers. The life of the least of men pictures them in day and night, waking and sleeping, birth and death. Quote, "For these two, light and dark, day and night, are the world's eternal ways." So here he's describing these beings that have come in many, many ages past and continue this process of evolving humanity, and out of that evolution comes more great men, more elder brothers. We should make a quick note, of course, that when we say great men or elder brothers, we don't mean in any way a gender-specific thing. These are obviously just as common to be women. It's not at that level. We're not really talking about gender at all when we completely transcended physical form. In every age and complete national history, these men of power and compassion are given different designations. They have been called initiates, adepts, magi, hierophants, kings of the East, wise men, brothers, and whatnot. But in the Sanskrit language, there is a word which, being applied to them, at once thoroughly identifies them with humanity. It is Mahatma. This is composed of Maha, great, and Atma, soul. So it means great soul, and as all men are souls, the distinction of the Mahatma lies in greatness. The term Mahatma has come into wide use through the Theosophical Society, as Madame H.P. Blavatsky constantly referred to them as her masters, who gave her the knowledge she possessed. They were at first known only as the brothers, but afterwards, when many Hindus flocked to the Theosophical Movement, the name Mahatma was brought into use, inasmuch as it has behind it an immense body of Indian tradition and literature. At different times, unscrupulous enemies of the Theosophical Society have said that even this name had been invented and that such beings are not known of among the Indians or in their literature. But these assertions are made only to discredit, if possible, a philosophical movement that threatens to completely upset prevailing erroneous theological dogmas. For all through Hindu literature, Mahatmas are often spoken of, and in parts of the north of that country the term is common. In the very old poem, the Bhagavad Gita, revered by all Hindu sects, and admitted by the Western critics to be noble as well as beautiful, there is a verse reading, "Such a Mahatma is difficult to find," quote unquote. That's in chapter 7 and on page 56 in the ULT publication. So here again, she's providing us with some, he's providing us with some of the background on the Mahatmas and how they interact with the movement of Theosophy and how they interact with humanity over timeless ages. It also illustrates that no attack from outside, no alignment of enemies against the Theosophical movement can really have any lasting impact. These are processes, this evolution, and this is knowledge, checked and rechecked by endless series of adepts, as HPB says in The Secret Doctrine, that is impervious to the comings and goings of criticisms that may come from time to time into the movement. Let's see. I'll leave time for questions and answers. Let's do one more. I must tell you that during the last quarter of every 100 years, an attempt is made by those masters of whom I have spoken to help on the spiritual progress of humanity in a marked and definite way. Towards the close of each century, you will invariably find that an outpouring or upheaval of spirituality, or call it mysticism if you prefer, has taken place. Some one or more persons have appeared in the world as their agents, and a greater or less amount of occult knowledge and teachings has been given out. If you care to do so, you can trace these movements back century by century as far as our detailed historical records extend. This is in the Key to Theosophy at the very end. She's talking here about the impulsions of the Theosophical movement that happens every 100 years, beginning in the 1400s, the 13th century, with Tsongkhapa. He established a 100-year cycle of theosophical impulse that, of course, continues on to this day. So we'll leave it at that. That actually, I guess I wanted to say, establishes a sort of another series of who are the great teachers, right? You can look back from HBB and Judge for the 19th century cycle, and you can go back to the 18th century cycle and look at what was happening historically then with the Revolutionary War, both here and in France. You can go back from there through, every 100 years you go back through figures like Pico della Mirandola, and then there's Paracelsus connects, and the Rosicrucian movement is there. Giordano Bruno, Cagliostro, these are all the luminaries that were in their time responsible for putting out what could be put out at the time in a theosophical context, even though they may or may not have used the word theosophy itself. The movement is not limited by the name placed upon it in that sense. But never has there been such a clear exposition and vocabulary presented than the 1875 cycle provided by H.B. Blavatsky, William Hugh Judge, and the Theosophical Mahatmas that stood behind them. So with that, we'll open it up for questions and comments. Yes, please.
You ended up kind of where I was thinking about. These two, HPB and Mr. Judge, like others before them, got a lot of criticism because they were bringing out things that had been not brought out before in writing and in their interactions. You started out talking about minimizing Mahatmas and so forth. This student was doing some research about a particular topic, and he was criticized for focusing on the Mahatmas, Mr. Judge was at that time. There was discussion of that topic, almost word for word, just like he put it out. However, in looking at the theosophical literature, there were 2 paragraphs missing on the internet. Those 2 paragraphs were about Mahatmas. That was the first 2 paragraphs of his article. They weren't there. So I think what I'm trying to get at, it's very difficult because they're not necessarily physically present, where the materialists can see them.
Right.
They're assumed not to exist. You mentioned that they are really very much part of the real Hindu philosophy, as much as clearly the way this student sees it, Theosophy has no reason to exist other than to give us a track to become, it didn't give us to us, it points out a track to become a Mahatma eventually. So I'm not sure what my question was now. But it really struck me when you were talking about minimizing Mahatmas.
Right.
This student's experience.
This tendency to minimize the influence of the Mahatmas, or the idea that they exist at all, certainly creeps in, but only where there's room for it, and we make room for those ideas. For a fear, we make room for fear and anxiety about discussing the Mahatmas. When, at least the way it's presented here, and it's fairly obvious, I guess, when there's some fear of being judged by a scientist or being judged by a religionist, right? So many of us grow up in communities of scientists and religionists, and our families may be bad, and our friends may be bad, and we as spiritual students are open-minded to these ideas, and so it resonates with us, but we know that it may not with them. And for fear of being confrontational or antagonistic, or for creating ill will, we might minimize our discussion of the Mahatmas. There is this idea of pearls before swine, right? I mean, you don't necessarily want to put out material that is just going to be met with derision, right? You need to look for fertile ground. The parable of the sower comes to mind, right? You spread the seeds, and it will fall on fertile ground in some places, and it won't in others. But we certainly don't want to be dogmatic in our presentation of this idea, right? The danger of being dogmatic exists even within Theosophy, and Theosophy itself does not require the adherence to any of these things. It requires only a conviction of universal brotherhood. That is the single requirement for participation in a theosophical community. So I think we have some.
I just want to follow up because something else struck me while you were out, and then the next it seems like at the beginning of everything, the impulse, the 1975 impulse was there. Now we are sort of at a crossroads again, because we have the original teachings that were presented to us. And there seems to be a continuing minimization of that, and where it seems like it's a very important yardstick for measurement of movements that are occurring to have that available to us.
Indeed.
And it's a real, it's an issue that this is coming up now. That's why I just kind of mentioned that.
I mean, perhaps the greatest single service rendered by the United Lodge of Theosophists is keeping the original material in print and making that material available for the future of the movement. Right? As HPV says in the Key to Theosophy, there'll be a vocabulary there in place for the future teachers of the movement, and that's largely been put in place by ULT.
Two things I would like to bring to the attention. One is, you said that the masters were human before. The masters are human. Once you're a human, you're a human.
Indeed.
You never change.
Right.
She says we're just like them, only different in degree.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing you mentioned is that the companions are needed in the world to work with, and you referred to Mr. Judge and HPV as such. To those students' understanding, that is a little bit warped in the sense that they were initiates. They were sworn initiates to the masters, whereas the companions disseminating this information in the world might not be. That we're just ordinary students.
Sure.
Doing our very best in trying to promulgate the teachings as we understand it.
Right. Yeah, there is very little in the way of clarification on this word companions. So it is open to some interpretation. I think your interpretation is just as valid as what mine might be. Since it wasn't specified in the article, the distinction, I think, in this student's mind is that the Mahatmas were not working publicly. They were working behind the scenes. They were the masters, as referred to. Right? They said masters and companions, whereas Blavatsky and Judge and countless others throughout the ages were working publicly by putting this information out. Certainly there are degrees. There's an article that we could refer to called Chelas and Lay Chelas. Right? A Chela is a student, and a student that is pledged to a master. A lay Chela is someone who is in preparation for that path. So some clarification might be available through a resource like that, but you're absolutely right. There may be more distinctions there than I can point to in the article.
Yeah. In spiritualism today and in the past as well, there are many who claim to be great teachers, who say they have authentic knowledge, ancient wisdom, they're the channels. What does Theosophy say in terms of discernment? I think the whole talk, you touched upon it, but I'd appreciate it if you can summarize it as to how a student should differentiate and what should one pay attention to in terms of when you're searching for truth.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point, and it is addressed by Judge and Blavatsky when they talk about this desire to see a Mahatma, to meet a Mahatma, to see one personally with one's own eyes. That is is sort of a giveaway at that point that you're really not talking about Mahatmas. You cannot see them unless you have reached a certain clarity of mind. She says you have to see them with your intellectual sight. You know, you have to have refined your monastic principle sufficiently to approach their level of consciousness. And so in doing that, we develop that discernment. Right? Discernment's a great word. We have to be discerning. We have to be discriminating in our evaluation of all of these things. And it's probably useful to realize that the whole of Theosophy doesn't come out in all in one place or all at one time. She says, it's the storehouse of all truths uttered by great seers, at least as many as it can get. Right? So it is incomplete, sort of by definition, right there in the key of Theosophy. So it's the channel through which more or less of truth, her words, found in the accumulated utterances of humanity's great teachers. Right? So teachers come in many forms. Some we could observe their impact, like the Theosophical Mahatmas that HPB and Judge refer to, and see pretty clearly that these are what we would call Mahatmas. Others we may not see in that same light, but may still have some of the same truths available and are able to impart those in some way to the world. Where things obviously get dangerous, where we see many warnings, is that this material should always be free and freely available. It should never be something where only the wealthy have access to, or that you have to pay some kind of a price for. Excessive cost, right, is often a red flag in evaluating these kinds of teachings. Obviously, it does cost money to manufacture books, right? These are real goods, and it requires a certain amount of material. In the case of the United Lodge of Theosophists, the labor is entirely donated, right? No one is charging for their time when they make these books, and there's no profit markup on any of it. It's all just the cost is passed through, which is why the books in any ULT are very inexpensive. That isn't necessarily the case in other publishing efforts, for example. So these are just some signs that we can help us to navigate the waters. There are lots of false teachers out there and lots of things to be wary of in that regard.
I think the other point perhaps would be that those who are sworn to the Master's Lodge would never ever claim any such. Right. That they would not say.
Right. Those who know don't say, and those who say don't know.
And those who publicly announce that I have received this, that, the other, it's a giveaway that they truly are not. Right.
Well, our discernment has to come into it even still. HVB said that she received communications from the Mahatmas, and we believe her. We can't hold one standard for her and another standard for everyone else, right? So we have to ask ourselves, why do her claims have the ring of authenticity, and others don't? And it's really it's up to us as individuals to hold up everything we read or hear or see or experience to the light of reason that we develop within ourselves. This is very challenging. It's probably the most challenging thing about being a theosophical student, is to take everything and analyze it against our own experience, our own sense of reason, our own intuition, enlightened belief. You know, these are the things that contribute to our discernment and our discrimination. And everything we encounter has to be, including HPB and Judge, and everything else, has to be put through the same test.
Well, those books, they prove themselves.
They are, the inherent consistency and logic throughout a body of literature as vast as this. There is nothing else like that. Even science, which is, itself founded on the principles of reproducibility and inherent consistency, has been a long process of refuting previous claims and learning more and understanding more and going back and reevaluating. Right, that process has given us a body of scientific knowledge that is evolving and becoming in a way that requires this constant evaluation. We need to apply that same standard of validity to the anything we read, whether it's within a philosophical context or a spiritual context or a scientific context. Those standards of validity hold true even within Theosophy.
But there's a tremendous difference between those books and scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is based on hypothetical analysis. You're trying to prove a point. And when a further study brings new information into the arena, then it can be changed. Right. That's what it is based on. This is the accumulated wisdom of sages through thousands and thousands of years, and it's been verified. It's a complete system.
Right.
Even if it is in a skeletal form and we're expected to fill it in,
right.
There's a difference there. This is the truth as much as it could be given. Only a corner of the leaf was open, just it's very small amount of it. And even that, how many years have we been studying and how much have we digested? And every time you go to it, something new reveals itself. Right. It just shows you that it is not the same as the others.
Agreed.
It's not that I'm putting it on a pedestal.
No.
It speaks of itself.
Well, and it speaks to a very different part of our nature.
Of course.
It is not strictly an intellectual pursuit. Science doesn't even pretend to go beyond intellectual, right? It doesn't have any delusions of being something more than that. In fact, it rejects that there is anything beyond an intellectual. And that's fine. Science can begin and end within that space if it wants. There are those who perceive something more, something beyond that, and they enter into a different space, which is what you're talking about, where you can look at the accumulated wisdom of the ages, check it against your own sense of reason. I don't have the quote in front of me, but HPB talks about the accumulated wisdom of the ages being checked and tested by an endless series of adepts throughout the ages. That is the scientific method. So, but it's not science that we're applying to Theosophy, and this is a good distinction that I think you helped me make here. It's that method of the adepts, the seers, checking it against each other's findings that we use in science. Right? It existed before this thing that we call science in the most sort of mundane sense. Interestingly, science itself is of late, and I say of late meaning just the last few decades, treading into very metaphysical waters. You can read modern studies these days, particularly in physics, and see, but also in biology, and see a lot of new ideas being put forth that resonate very much with theosophical ideas. So we should always be on the lookout for how the mind of humanity as a whole is evolving and finding correspondences with things that we can test through the tools of an intellectual science and find results that resonate with a scientific with a spiritual body of knowledge, so to speak. Any other comments or questions? thank you very much. We've reached our time. I don't have to talk
Next week's is on Theosophy in Africa, and we're going to take a break for a little while, and then we'll start our afternoon meeting round table on the key to Theosophy by HPV. And please join us next week for Theosophy in Africa.
Theosophy in Africa. Thank you.